welcome back. Again, my name is Second Lieutenant Flood, and we are continuing on with our series. Today we're moving into World War I. Let's begin by asking ourselves a question. World War I. So what does this name kind of connote? It means that there is a conflict that involves most of the world. And this is somewhat foreign, especially to the US, because we were usually in war with one other country. Maybe fighting a couple different territories, but one other country. And now the US is going to be getting involved in a conflict that involves many different countries. So this is a change of pace in terms of warfare. So introducing how this war got started, nationalism, or this pride in one's country, and militarism, or the desire to build up huge militaries, are a theme that are going to be going on across the world. And inevitably, when people become extremely proud of their country and the militaries become extremely large, what's the best way to show that your country is the best? To defeat them in battle, okay? And this is going to be something that will set the table for why this conflict breaks out. A little backstory as to the real reason, and it's not one as dramatic as you would think, is it begins with this territory in Serbia, where we have this Serbian terrorist group known as the Black Hand. And they are interested in showing their overlords, Austria-Hungary, that they don't want them ruling over them anymore. So without getting too far into the details, Austria-Hungary, big empire, they control this smaller territory known as Bosnia/Serbia. And these people living there say, we're tired of being ruled by Austria, and we're going to kill the Archduke to express our anger. So as the plot unfolds, the Archduke is killed by the Black Hand, and from this we get the First World War. Reasons for this is a lot of alliances were already drawn up before this assassination happened. So Austria-Hungary was tied up with Germany, and then Serbia had an alliance with Russia, who therein had an alliance with France and the UK. And from this, the tree of both sides only grew and eventually became a world conflict. So that's why it's important to know that the First World War, it didn't happen from a big, huge attack. It was a small terror group that killed an Archduke, which caused the First World War to break out. Okay, as always, we talk about the role of Iowa in these conflicts, so let's get to that today. Iowa had soldiers that were a part of the 42nd Rainbow Division. The Rainbow Division is very famous, in part because it was made up of people from many different National Guard units. That's where it got its name from. The idea that we have many different groups coming together to fight in one division. The 42nd Division participated in the final Great Allied Offensive at Meuse-Argonne, and it was at this battle that they were seeing a lot of the conflict from the Western Front. Think about that term, the Western Front. Where have you heard that before? If anything, you probably heard it from trench warfare. Trench warfare is something that's going to be very notable in the First World War. And if you haven't, I would recommend that you would look that up on your own time and take a look at what that looked like. A trench, if you are familiar with it, is something where you have a built-in kind of almost tunnel, and in the middle you have a space. And that space was called no man's land. So why do you think with two trenches built up and the space in the middle called no man's land, this war is not going to be making a lot of progress? It's because both sides are firing at each other, and the only progress that could be made is if you were to scale through no man's land, where there could be mines, mustard gas, definitely machine gun fire coming at you, go into the other enemy's trench and take out as many of them as possible. This is not a recipe for making any progress, but nonetheless, this is where World War I was primarily fought. And it's where the 42nd Rainbow Division, where we had many Iowans involved, participated. An important thing to note, we mentioned earlier that the 168 Infantry crest has a palm tree, and that's from the Spanish-American War. It also has a rainbow, and that's because of its integration with the 42nd Rainbow Division. So as we move throughout these conflicts, again, we're seeing connections to symbols and names that we have with us today. All right, we're going to be revisiting a name we talked about earlier. So think back to the Civil War. Who was an important person that has a base in Iowa named after them? It's Camp Dodge. So General Greenville M. Dodge, who Camp Dodge is named after, became important in that Camp Dodge was a very notable point for training soldiers before they entered into World War I. And this is because on June 15th of 1917, the U.S. Army Selection Board selected Camp Dodge as one of the 16 regional training camps for the U.S. Army. So effectively for much of the Midwest, people would come to Camp Dodge to train before they were sent off to participate in the First World War. And this facility was actually very well built. It could host around 40,000 people at its capacity. And something interesting to note is that trenches were created to simulate trench warfare so that they could practice those tactics with trenches. And this is something that as Iowans we had forgotten about over time until it was discovered that the trenches were still there and they were unearthed, and not too long ago they were actually recreated. And so today you can go up to Camp Dodge and see where this trench warfare training took place. And usually there's a what's called a trench run where you can actually run through the trenches. So it's a good way to learn about history and get some fitness in as well. Okay, let's talk about some more Iowans in this conflict. If you have ever been to Des Moines, particularly on the northern side of Des Moines, you've probably been on a busy street called Merle Hay Road. Merle Hay, he was very important in that he was from Iowa and he voluntarily enlisted himself, but he fought near the Artois in France, so this is going to be in the trenches as well. And he was actually notable because he was killed in these trench warfare conflicts, and he was one of the first Iowans to die. And because of his notable service, he had Merle Hay Road named in his honor. Some other important people, Marion Crandall. So imagine that you are getting done with school, you want to get involved in the conflict, you're a teacher, like me. This lady was a French teacher, and she recognized the U.S. was in need of support, and she lent her services as being a translator between the French and people who spoke English, and went over and helped to fight in this war effort. Unfortunately, she was killed from German artillery shells, but nonetheless a noble person from the state of Iowa. Going back to thinking of street names that are familiar, if you've been on the south side of Des Moines, you're probably familiar with Fleur Road. This is because Edward O'Fleur, who was a Des Moines native, lived in Des Moines. He entered World War I. He was captain. He was in the 168 Infantry. He died from a German gas attack, but nonetheless, notable service and a road named after him today. As we're wrapping up this conflict, let's think about how the U.S. Got involved. So, as you're going to be learning from your class at some point, you're going to be talking about how a note called the Zimmerman Note was sent to Mexico in efforts to help keep the U.S. out of the conflict. So what had happened was that Germany recognized that if the Americans joined the war, they're going to join the side of the British and the French, the Allied side. And that would cause disaster for the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, and that the Americans would be fresh, they'd have a lot of resources, and they could definitely defeat the Central Powers. So Germany had sent a telegram to Mexico saying, if you fight against the U.S. and effectively keep them busy, prevent them from coming to war with us, we will give you the former territories that the U.S. had taken from you in which conflict? That's right, the Mexican-American War. So this telegraph, only meant for Mexico, was actually intercepted by U.S. intelligence, delivered to the president, and effectively said, we don't have a choice, we have to get involved now. So the irony of this whole event is that, why did Germany send this telegram to Mexico? It was to keep the U.S. out of the conflict. But what in effect did this telegram do? It got the U.S. directly involved in World War I. So Germany's effort to keep the U.S. out of the war got them involved. So the U.S. joins the war effort and is able to help secure victory for the Allies, and this will prompt a German and Austria-Hungary surrender. Okay, the war is important to note in that the point of surrender obviously ended the war, but some may argue created another one. So this famous surrender took place at the Treaty of Versailles, and at this treaty, the terms were decided by the Allies, and these terms were that Germany was to take full blame for the First World War, and also that they were to pay for all of the war debts. So later on, after this video, think about how fair that might be. How would you feel if you had to accept full blame for the war and pay all the war debts, even though you were just one country among, well, a world war? Seems pretty unfair. And it's actually this feeling of resentment that Germany will build upon for the Second World War, when someone by the name of Adolf Hitler takes advantage of these negative feelings that Germany's feeling and tries to use them to bring them up again. And so at the Treaty of Versailles, Germany again takes full blame for the war, has to pay for all the war debts, and in effect, a lot of resentment is building up in Germany so that when World War II comes around, they have a reason to be upset and a reason to want to go to war again. So, this will conclude our lesson on the First World War. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.